Today is our first community developer webinar, and I'm very excited to be leading this. My name's Kadi McKean. I'm the community manager here. Today, with me to go through this journey for Developer's Guide to Software Supply Chain, we have two phenomenal speakers with us. We have Andy Lewis, who's a founding OWASP Denver chapter member here. And we also have Steve Poole, who is Java champion, 30 plus years experience, and I would say developer extraordinaire based out of London. So before we dive into the questions, I'm going to let everybody get a little bit more comfortable with who you guys are. Tell them a little bit about yourself and why you're here today. So, Steve, you want to go first?
Oh, of course, yes. So well, I'm reading, my name is Steve Spool, but it's Poole, P-double-L-E. I'm a long-time engineer. I've done a lot of stuff, but I'm engineer, DevOps leader, security person, bit of everything. A lot of passion around now about let's teach developers how to be more security conscious. And for the last few years, that's what I've been pushing on. So how do we get people to understand the challenges and how do we help them solve it?
Beautiful. Well, thanks for being here.
Yep.
Andy?
Andy Lewis, former Marine. I see Deeds in the chat here. Good morning, John. Background is IT ops, IT security ops. About 10 years ago, one of my sales reps poached me over to become a sales engineer. Lots of fun. And a few weeks ago, I changed roles again. And Katie, I'm here helping you. So thanks for having me.
All right. Well, let's dive in, guys. So before we get to the first question, I want to pop up a poll just to kind of gauge where everybody in the audience is at so we can make sure we're driving this conversation, right, in the right way. So first question is, how would you define the software supply chain? So let's give you about 30 seconds to see how this goes. All right. We've got 5 answers. Seems pretty unanimous on this side. All right, so popular answer here by far, about 94% of everyone said that the full life cycle of software components from developers to deployment. We did have a few answers for tools and frameworks used to build software. So that's kind of knowledge setting where we're at today in the audience. So I think the first place I want to start with today is when we say software supply chain, what do we mean by it? Can you guys help me break down what this means? I know it's a loaded question, but there's so much that goes into it that I think it'd be helpful to level set this conversation by understanding what we mean by software supply chain.
Yeah. Well, I think your audience has got it mostly right. When we talk about software supply chain, often when we talk to developers, we think about the software dependencies. That's like where it starts. But then, of course, it's bigger than that. So the software supply chain is the dependencies that you choose. It's the compilers you use. It's the platforms you run on. It's the processes that you use, and not just like your CI/CD processes. It's things like, do you have an end-of-life process? How do you report vulnerabilities, or how do you let your users report vulnerabilities? So it's the process of creating software. So it's the tools, the processes, those are the aspects. And then, of course, hidden all this, the thing that you hear occasionally is people talk about turtles, which is your software supply chain is also the tip of all the other software supply chains that are out there for every piece of software that you're using. So depending how you look at it, it's either something fairly simple or it's actually pretty infinite.
Anything to add?
No, I think Steve got it. I think that the only thing that kind of represents a paradigm shift is a hardened package release can be a lot trickier to compromise than an upstream component, which may have a lot fewer protections. And so if I can assimilate a compromised component into that hardened release, then we have SolarWinds 2.0 and everybody's unhappy for at least a week.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So compromising these things, completely different story.
So let's get into this. Why is
Yeah.
securing software supply chain right now more important than ever? So I think you guys alluded to it with SolarWinds, but
Yeah.
why is this becoming such a huge deal right now in the industry?
Well, so let's be honest. It's such a big question because simple question, big answer. There's lots of things going on. Let's pick a few things. So one of the things that some of the pragmatics here is that when you look at all the different ways that cyber attacks take place, at the root of these things, almost always is some sort of software vulnerability. So the supply chain is the bit that delivers software, is the piece that we use to create our packages, our products, our services, and its flaws in that process and its flaws in the software that we consume that tend to let the bad guys in. So the software supply chain is seen as being not an enabler, but it's the first point of call, and it's the point of call for most of how the bad attacks start. How do they get in? They get in through some vulnerabilities, some ability to run code, RCEs or something like that. And quite often, you can point it at some weakness in the software supply chain. So that's the primary thing. Is everybody understands that if you're looking for the what should we fix first to fix the most problems, you talk about software supply chain. The other thing here is because it's so weak, because we are not too good at managing these things, we have a lot more focus from the bad guys, the bad actors, and so we have this sort of we say two-way street here. We're not very good at doing it, so we need to do better. And because we're not doing very good at it, we have more attackers. So that's why we're all talking about taking the software supply chain and making it more secure, because of that sort of situation.
Andy, anything to add?
You covered it. I think hopefully that makes sense. Jump into the chat, or remember that the QA is open, and if you need us to backtrack and explain, please do so. Please jump in there. So, but I thought that was great. Thanks, Steve.
So I think it was interesting, Steve, you were talking about how the bad guys are getting in more than ever, right? And we were actually talking about this a few weeks ago, where there's just so many different ways that they can get in now, whether it's social engineering through, sock puppets, or if there's other
Yeah.
ways with like traditional attacks. So are you seeing an increase in these types of attacks, or they're becoming more and more novel attacks in this space, especially from a
Yes.
development perspective?
Absolutely. So the sock puppet attack that you alluded to is where you use social engineering to convince a owner of an open source project to either relinquish control or to allow things to happen that perhaps they shouldn't. And it's called a sock puppet attack because what you see is one or two real human beings pretending to be multiple fictitious online personas who all say the same thing. And what we're beginning to see is those things being done not just by human beings, but we're beginning to see the AI, the chat GPT style of things, where it's much more realistic. So we're certainly seeing a lot more like that. I mean, the amount of money that people make out of, the amount of money that the bad guys can make out of this is just so large that we're seeing just how do you describe it? The value to them is so large, and what we've seen in the last couple of years has been this recognition that it isn't just about money anymore. So ransomware has always been the big thing. We see that happen all the time. Ransomware can be seen sometimes as being a demonstration of a technique that works. If you can get into a system to and apply ransomware, it shows you've got into a system. What we've seen is how often now those attacks are being used not just to make money, but also for cyber warfare type attacks, where you're trying to influence somebody's economy by getting into their systems and doing bad things. So the reasons that people are attacking software, what they're trying to get out of it is growing. The amount of money they make out of this, I think this year we said it reached $9 trillion, which is just unimaginable amount of money. So the value proposition to the bad guys, whether they're state actors or whether they're just blackmailers, whatever, is too good to pass up. Everybody's getting on the bandwagon, and as I said at the beginning, we all understand that where we are in terms of software security of the supply chain is just not good enough. We have a long way to go.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more, because we are seeing more nation states being backed by it, or even some countries where that is their number one income is coming from
Yeah.
these types of attacks, which is a little bit unsettling in today's times. But
Yes, I
to
mean,
your point,
yeah. So there was one. Was it a few weeks ago where we heard about one single hack stole $1 billion worth of Bitcoin. It's like, there we go. That's why they do it.
and for those of you at home, we do have a blog on that, so you can check that out in our blog resources, because Carolyn did write about that. So check it out.
Address. So if they're wanting to tip us, you just hit that wallet address at the bottom. We'll get our share of Bitcoin too.
So we've talked about what software supply chain is. We've talked about some of the implications, who's doing this, different types of attacks. How does software supply chain security differ from traditional application security? Because I do feel this is it's a different approach than what we've previously seen. And now with these new novel attacks coming out, every other Tuesday, we really have to kind of change our approach in how we're responding to these attacks or being prepared. So how would you say we've changed or evolved from a traditional security approach?
I have some thoughts, but let Andy start.
Oh yeah. So look, nothing's new under the sun. It's the same problem. It's input validation. So when you look at traditional application security, you're trying to write code that's resistant to, say, for example, injection vulnerabilities or buffer overflows or what have you. But it's your code. You want to write it so that it's not easy to knock over. But when you start to look at the supply chain, it's not about your code. It's about what you pulled in and the baggage that comes with that. And in some cases, think about something that's backdoored, which we're seeing. I mean, Katie, you've got the site up right now. It's a free resource. You can go up there, and maybe we'll show this later, but start to type in some libraries on some of those repos. And typo squatting is a thing. You'll start to see that there are people who are in the business of putting things on the repos that are actively able to attack or backdoor, siphon data, or run ransomware, or run a crypto miner, whatever, right? And that's a whole different ball game than, hey, I don't want my data to get all filtered out. No, it's when you start to think about the implications of a crypto miner in a subsidiary library of something that's designed to scale, which is what cloud software does. Think about that thing starting to mine. Now the CPU starts to go up. Now your cloud environment starts to cloud burst, starts to expand. Those guys are making a lot of money. It's costing you money to do it. And, yeah, you could say, hey, maybe nobody got hurt, but your CFO would probably disagree. So
Yeah.
hopefully that makes sense. I think what it comes down to is, there's an expectation that we're going to clean our own house and release code that is resistant to attack compared to, hey, up to 80% of code being released right now is somebody else's code. And so it's important to have those controls to make sure that you didn't bring in something that's weaponized. So I
Yeah.
get that mostly right, Steve?
Yeah. Well, I think you can carry on. There's more to talk about for sure, but you're right. If I look at it and say, what's the difference? The difference is that when we think about security, we think about data inputs and those we think about data being stolen and those sort of credentials and things like that. When we talk about software supply chain security, we don't really think in the terms of security. We think maybe about managing keys and things, but whereas you're likely to have, you hire pen testers and they'll go off and tell you whether your site can be compromised. You'll do threat analysis. You'll do all those sorts of things because you have people whose job is to prevent bad people getting into your system. But when you look at the software supply chain, the amount of effort that we put into keeping that secure, even thinking about the problem, it's left with the developer. And so it's just a different space. So we're realizing that the trust levels are different. So if you look at how your website, you're certainly not going to start with the thought that you're going to trust the people who are going to be, trying to use your website. You're going to have some thought that there may be some bad guys out there who are trying to get into your system. And that's because we know that's what happens. And we have people, IT guys who worry about that. When you look at software supply chain, most often we have very little thought. We're quite naive about how we think about software. We have much more of a trusting activity approach. And that a lot comes from, as you said, Andy, 80% or more of the software that you use comes from somebody else. And where does it come from? It comes from open source projects. So we have this enormous community of people who are contributing code for the good of everybody else. And so for many years, we've had the luxury of being able to trust them. But now what we begin to see is that we can't, we have to worry about whether we can trust them. We have to learn to verify first. And the other thing is that, again, coming back to the value proposition from the bad guys' point of view, even if you do trust the open source project, in terms of the people who work on it, you've got to ask yourselves whether they have good security posture. Do those guys think about, I don't know, vulnerabilities and all those things? And if they do, what about the ones that they consume? Because obviously every dependency has some more dependencies. So your tree of dependencies, if you have one component in that tree who isn't very good at security from a software supply chain point of view, you're vulnerable. And so there we go. The difference is we're pretty good to a degree at understanding about the sort of internet facing live attacks, those sorts of things, but we're not very good yet at understanding about how to secure the process of creating software. Scary? You bet.
A little bit terrifying, I'm not gonna lie.
Yeah.
Especially when you think of how far down in the dependency tree some of these things happen. You know what I mean? Like take Log4j, for example, where it was just so far down in there, people are basically looking for a needle in a haystack at that point.
Yeah.
So,
John
I think
brings up, oh, I'm sorry, Katie, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, like John brings up in the chat, right? XEUtils, we talked about that last week, where, not only is there a problem, but it's a problem where the blast radius is the entire flipping internet, right? Every Linux distro relies on XEUtils. And the fact that got backdoored and made it all the way into beta ought to tell you that you need better controls. So thanks for bringing that up, John.
Yeah, that's a great example.
I think what it shows you, good. So I think what it shows you is the world that we're living in now. We have people who are actively trying to attack us. So we've got to deal with that reality. We've got to understand that the software we're consuming is going to come with various levels of quality or security control. So we have to deal with that, and we can't ignore it. It's not going to go away. It's never going to go away. What we have to learn is how to mitigate it and how to build the right defenses, find the right tools to help, and be much more conscious of the problem. So we have to move away from thinking about this sort of security aspect as risk and start to understand it's not risk anymore. Risk sounds like insurance. I'll spend a bit more money, and if the thing does happen, I'm covered. We're not talking about risk, we're talking about certainty. So if somebody's going to attack you at some point and they get in, what are you doing now to mitigate it? What are you doing to discover it? Those are the thought processes you need to have. And many of them are very similar to how we think about when the internet facing systems we produce. It's like, take the same mentality and start to apply it to the software supply chain.
Yeah. I think it's interesting too, where we've started moving away from it. And like you said, it's kind of like insurance, but it's also, I think I would take it a step farther, is you have to expect it's going to happen at some point. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when now that we're looking at, right? So what are you doing today to make sure that when that happens, you're prepared and you can fight it off quickly? So, we've talked about the XC utils, we talked about sock puppets. What are some other examples of real world supply chain attacks, and what lessons have we learned from them? Because there's a few that come to mind that I can think of, right? But I'm curious to see what are the big ones that you all learn from.
Oh, can we do the Log4j one first? Because that's the big one.
Standard? Yeah, go ahead.
Yes. So okay, so Log4j is a really good example of what was going on. So it's a design change. So we have the people of who create Log4j made a design decision, and their design decision was triggered more about providing capability and functionality than security. That gets into the system. It is flagged very early on. The Log4j vulnerability was around for years before anything actually happened. Then finally, we have a situation, people begin to realize what's going on, people are being hacked. It's a very, very bad vulnerability. It lets people get into your system and steal data or basically do whatever they do. And because the way it's engineered, they can have complete control of your system, and you may not ever know because of the way it works. So it's a very bad system. There is a solution to it. The fix, the vulnerability is out the same day. So we have a solution. And then what happens? It takes literally years. It's still going on. I think the last number was something like 13 or 14% of downloads of Log4j from Data Central are still of vulnerable versions. So if you want the canonical thing that tells us, that shows how do we put this? How we're not paying attention, Log4j is the big one. And the fact that it's still going on, right? So that shows you that, I don't know, let's be charitable and say it's down to 10%. That means 10% of the people out there creating software aren't paying attention. And there you go. There's an example. In fact, they say that Log4j was pretty much the straw that broke the camel's back as far as much as many of the legislation groups are concerned, because it demonstrated that the software industry couldn't police itself. Right?
Yeah.
So that's my favorite for all those. It just has so many edges in terms of being very bad, and that it happened for the right reasons, but without the right thought processes. And then when it was put out, the development community took months, years to grok what was going on.
I think we're still facing some of that reckoning today.
Yeah.
And I think we're going to continue for a while. There's also other examples within these supply chain attacks, because to your point earlier, we're all running on open source, and there's so many different things like maintainer burnout, abandonware, or, social engineering on these things. But, I remember a few years ago, there was that colors and fakers issue where the maintainer had gone away, wasn't able to do it anymore. And then you had someone step up and it was riddled, with malware.
Yeah.
So it's just kind of crazy how some of this stuff is still infecting people, or it's a known attack and people are still downloading it, to your point about Log4j, with about 14% of people still actually downloading it.
Yeah.
Which is crazy.
Yeah. So our assumption is, my general assumption is that two things are going on. One is that people don't realize they're downloading this. And that's not surprising. One of the things that you notice about software development processes is how often the company doesn't actually know what the developers are doing, that there are edge services, so like there may be a mirror. So maybe the download isn't getting into your product, maybe it's downloaded into some local mirror. So you have that thing that obfuscates it. But we also realize that when you talk to people about Log4j, they do not understand. I did a talk a couple of years ago literally about Log4j. And at the end of it, this guy came up and he was, I think it was a Cisco or something, and we had a conversation, and he explained to me how Log4j worked. And I went, no, you weren't listening. Let me explain how it works. And I explained to him the how vulnerable he was. And this poor guy went white. He just went pale. And he just left because he had the wrong understanding. So that's another thing that we see is that people, when they evaluate the risk, when they look at a CVE and they go, oh, that's not going to apply to me, they have the wrong understanding of the risk. They're much more charitable about it. And again, something else we need to do is help people be better at working out, the risk they're taking.
So Andy, what could people do, to help combat, to figure out if they are still infected from things like this?
Yeah, so obviously, we've got a tool that'll help. There's several open source tools, OWASP projects, and what have you. Bottom line is, if it's not inspected, it's neglected. If you're not checking, then you don't know what you brought in. And there's an anonymous attendee threw something in about zero trust. I think that when you're starting to talk about developers, zero trust for component libraries you're bringing in is kind of orders of magnitude of more complexity compared to them just pulling stuff down and hey, I know what it is and I'm going to put it in my build. So anyway, Katie, that's a long way of saying, hey, you know what? As before last week, I used to sell something at a company called ReversingLabs that could help a lot. This week, though, I'm in marketing helping you. So anytime you want to talk about that in detail, happy to help. So
Thank you.
yeah, you bet.
But I would say, and I'm here as an independent. The fact is that you have to look at these tools, wherever they come from. You need the tools because tools need data. This thing doesn't happen for free. Somebody somewhere has to put some effort to figure out how to find those missing those packages. So Log4j is an example of you're going, hey, Log4j is an obvious one. I know what to do. But somebody somewhere made the connection between that package and the CVE. Somebody somewhere else is writing tools that's going to scan your systems. And you have to, you need to invest in finding the right tools that are good at finding these vulnerabilities. If you depend on things like Dependabot, which itself is a good first level tool, it's going to find certain types of problem. But you need to start thinking about where these components that you're downloading end up and how would you discover them and what tools would you need to get them. And when you get to the next level, you start looking at finding malicious things. So like we all know about like virus checkers and things.
Yep.
You have to pay people to do the engineering to work out how to discover these things. So maybe the tool's free, but you need to go check to make sure that the tool that you're looking to use, the tools you use now, are actually able to find the things that they say they can find. Go test them.
Yeah, I completely agree with that.
Yeah.
So Steve, you had mentioned a talk you gave and trying to help somebody figure out what you had just told them. I had a guy come up after one of my talks to tell me that the guys that all the wrong lessons were learned from Log4j, and that the right lesson is find the 0 day, write the patch, add the backdoor code to the patch. When the internet melts down because there's a problem, make your commit. You're a hero, and you've now got internet-wide distribution of your backdoor because it's a patch, right? And that was Log4j. The other thing that people need to consider is when we talk about instrumentation and tools, if you think about a SolarWinds or a 3CX where it was the pipeline itself that was compromised, you have to have an offset or an out of band analysis capability. in addition to, shift left is the right way to go, right? You don't want to burn developer time. But if the pipeline itself is compromised, you don't have that offset. You don't know that your release hasn't been tampered with. One of the things that we like to equate it to is crash testing the car, right?
Mhm.
Everything has been QC'd all along the line, but when all the pieces are put together, you run it, flat out into a wall and make sure that everything works together as it's supposed to, right? So,
Yeah, 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 and that's true. But if we use software, the software analogy is that what the bad guys are going to try and do is they're going to try and insert the malware or whatever into the system after you crash test it.
yes,
Right?
which is why you want that offset way out to the right, where you've
Yeah,
got
yeah,
something that's out of band that is kind of a final check, or I don't know, crash test, whatever you want to call it. Yeah,
yeah. But
absolutely.
but you but you see when you look at it that when you look at these things, you see how often the failure in the supply chain is a very simple failure. So it's quite often you'll see the compromise comes right at the end. You have a packaging system, it zips stuff up, and you have the bad guys compromise that packaging step and they insert something, and you're done. So, classics are, like GitHub Actions. GitHub Actions, we talked about zero trust, or somebody mentioned zero trust. I will lay odds that pretty much everybody who's ever used GitHub Actions has selected something because it was somebody else said it was the right thing to do and never ever considered what was actually happening inside that GitHub action.
Yeah.
And that's what happens. You've got to look at every step of your pipeline and go, what bad things could happen? And and stop. You have to. This zero trust is exactly right. You have to start working out what bad things can happen because these guys are clever, and what are you going to do to detect it? You don't have to fix everything. You just got to know that these things have happened, and you've got to be comfortable that you've got the detection systems.
So we've talked a lot about, what software supply chain security is, some real world examples, and we're kind of moving now into steps to help with this prevention or just have a game plan. For someone who might be first starting out on their journey into this, what would you recommend that organizations to do? You know what I mean? What are those first steps in really understanding what their software supply chain is or how to bolster their security for it?
That's a very good question. Where would you start? So I think very much similar, like you see with threat analysis. You have a look at what you've got. And one of the things that I would say that you do as an organization is you go off and you find all the repos that you've got. Where are you? Where's the source code? If you're using any public repo, do you have a local version of that? How many of those can you find? And you need to look at each development team and go, what are you using? Because you need to start with what you've got. And what we know is quite often companies will have, I don't know, skunkworks or the equivalent of skunkworks. So
Mhm.
where things happen. And so the first step you've got to do is discover those. You can try and be draconian about it. You can start sticking up some firewalls and prevent people trying downloading things and see who shouts. But at the end of the day, you have to start with finding out what you've got. Once you've got that list, and be honest, if you're not doing that now, then you're never going to be able to manage patching vulnerabilities because if you don't know what you've got, how can you patch it? So you should be doing that anyway. But that's where I'd start was going build that inventory. What development teams you've got? What are they doing? Get them to put together some architecture diagrams of their build systems, you know, and then just start going through it and looking for those places where um, it's just vulnerable.
Annie, anything to add?
Yeah, I think it's hilarious, right? So again, where does it start? It starts with knowing what you got. How many times
Yeah,
have you been on the phone with a development team where they're like, "Yeah, we do it this way, but I know those guys are doing it that way." And so as an AppSec person trying to secure an organization, Steve's spot on. Hey, what do we have? Where is it? Who's using it? What are the intended outputs? What do we think are the trusted inputs? and then making sure that you've captured the risks around that process. So, but yeah, it's just super funny. I mean, look, number one control forever for security people has been what? Inventory. Number one, every single
Yeah.
time. And you know, if you don't know what you got, then first of all, you're just about normal, right? Second of all, you need to do something about it. And so that's all I'd add.
Yeah. Yeah. And then second, once you've got that thing, second, you look at all the dependency you've got, and you've got to start making decisions about whether you still want to keep those. So we know that almost always the decision about whether what technology is going to be used, whether a dependency or a OS or a compiler, or whatever, is made by a developer. And it's the only time that any scrutiny gets placed, because once you've made that decision, it's in the system. And so from then on, that you'll do is you'll patch it. But if you were to take a bit more thought and to reevaluate what your choices are, you might go that actually we're using things that have more likelihood of vulnerabilities than others. So one of the things that's happening in the industry, and it's beginning, is starting to evaluate or provide ways of evaluating, I'll say, the quality of open source projects, but more about than just quality and like bugs, but actually the whole security posture. So the CNCF and others, you may hear about a thing called scorecard. These are all attempts to begin to quantify the security posture and the quality, because we know that if the dependencies we use come from people and organizations that aren't particularly good engineers, they're more likely to have vulnerabilities in the future. So you need to start thinking about, when you choose software, not just for the functionality, but also start saying, is this a long-term investment? How likely, this thing may not have a vulnerability today, but what's the likelihood of this particular choice means that I'm going to have 10 vulnerabilities over the year? So every one of those you can preempt by going, let's choose something else, makes a big difference. That requires you to start getting involved with your development teams and start going, hey, we need to make better choices, not just because that's the latest JSON parser. It's, do we need one at all? And if we were start looking at the future, looking at legislation, one of the things you might start thinking about is whether you really want to pull in, 10 megabytes of dependency for one function, when you might actually want to just write it yourself.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And to your point about legislation, I mean, your neck of the woods has recently been in the news. You know, we've got stuff from NIST coming out on our end. We've had executive
Yeah.
orders here, but recently the UK did release a report on open source. So, can you walk us through some of the findings there and what's, you think the tailwind gonna be?
So it's no surprise. So, I mean, this has just been bubbling for ages, but it is absolutely no surprise. It's exactly the same thing as we've been talking. They're going, there's very little control of open source usage. There's very little ways of measuring the quality, and whatever term you want to put on it, of open source, and somebody should do something about it. Right? And literally, that's really we're at the same stage as everybody else. If you look at the legislation worldwide, we're seeing the same things. People are going, we need to do better. For us to do better, we need to create standards, which is why we're having lots of groups involved, existing groups around the world, as well as new people turning up, who are saying, let's define a standard. Obviously, those standards then will evolve into becoming legislation, or depending where you are in the world, maybe legislation. It may just be a good practices and things. And what we're beginning to realize is that it's very easy to say you should be able to check the quality of this software that you're using. It's a much harder job to actually work out what that really means.
Yeah.
So the UK, like everybody else, is jumping on the same bandwagon and going, we have all this open source that people are using. Lots of it has issues. How do we measure it? How do we control it? So yeah, so it's not a big deal. It's the same as pretty much everybody else. It's just, it's our turn.
Yeah, it makes sense because we all do see it keep going through the same thing. But when I was reading it, it did look very similar to some of the stuff we've seen here. I think
Yeah.
what
So
I
I'll say so. There was one other thing I should point out because it is worth bringing out just for this conversation. The other thing that they identified is that there's a lot of what may be disparate use of contribution to open source by large companies. So much as we imagine open source as being a group of, I don't know, nice people working on their free time for this, a lot of open source is funded by big business because they have their own interests. And the reason that's important is because as we see the legislation evolving, there's this conversation about who's going to fix these problems. And one of the things that keeps coming up is that if you're basically, they're saying the idea is that if you are empowered to fix something, so if you're contributing to an open source project and it's your own time, maybe you're not as responsible for fixing these problems as if you're a large corporation who's paying somebody else to do it. So one of the things that finding is bringing up is just reinforcing what we've seen in other countries, which is businesses have a responsibility, and it's not on the shoulders of the people who created Log4j specifically. It's unless they were paid to do it, it's on the responsibility is going to be on the commercial entities who are involved in this.
Yeah. And I think it's an interesting dynamic that is getting explored more and more now, especially with like the CRA regulation over in the EU, because there is a fine line between maintainer and then being paid to do it, you know, from a company, and also like the software producer and then the end user. So it's a very shifting dance that's going on right now, and trying to figure out what the right balance is, you know, anyone's guess. But I think we're starting to see it more and more take shape just because we're having so much more of these conversations.
Yeah.
So, you know, we've talked a lot today about, you know, what it is, examples, what can you do? You know, for me, and we've also talked about regulations, I just have a few final thoughts for this before we open it up to questions. You know, we've talked about making sure we trust where these packages come from. We do have a free resource here at Reversing Labs. It's our community edition. So check it out. It's secure.software. That's the site. It's easy to remember. And that's where you can go and look up these packages and look at the security of them. So we call it a safe score, where you can actually look for things like malware, tampering, hardening, vulnerabilities. So it goes through quite an in-depth inspection as to how these packages are. So when you are at that point of component selection, this is a really good place to start. So when you're building that list, like Steve talked about, of what you're using, this is a good place to validate if it's safe to use or not. So outside of that, I'm going to open it up to questions. I see we're at 11:45. So if you have a question, please put it in the Q&A. Happy to have Steve and Andy answer it. All right. Not seeing any takers today.
No. Oh, do you want to highlight findings?
So this is a great place. Thanks, Joe, for keeping us honest here. And this is actually what you'll see. So this is an example of what looking up a component looks like and what the safe score looks like. This is where you can actually dig in to each of those different categories, and it will tell you at a high level where the issues are and where you can find it in your code and how to fix it. I think the how to fix part is the part that is the most, the biggest benefit here, because sometimes that's the hardest part of the problem, right? Is what's wrong with this. So it's a good place to figure that out. Question.
Well, and if you look, one of the flags on this package is removed immediately adjacent to the flag that says malicious. Hey, if your people are pulling this thing down, this version down, probably the wrong answer, right? And it's fairly obvious. You don't need to get lost in the weeds. It's right there. Hey, it has been removed. So if you guys have got it cached, you ought not to trust it because it is weaponized, right? So uh, I think maybe that's worth pointing out. And then I don't know if you want to do a quick walkthrough or not, Katie, but I think the benefit of the tool is, yeah, you've now empowered your developers to understand if a library they're getting ready to pull down is going to be a problem. but it's a problem on a lot of different dimensions, right? So most people are very accustomed to looking for, hey, I want to look for vulnerabilities. That's not what this report is talking about. That's not the primary concern here. One of the things that Reversing Labs brings to the table is that huge data lake of malware samples and that analysis capability that says, yeah, hey, guess what? This one is weaponized. This one is a problem. And so I think, when you're looking at the tool, there are actually two use cases. One is if you're responsible for pulling down a library, you can check it and you can check it through a lot of different lenses. The second thing is if you're in AppSec, this is a perfect training tool because one of the things we haven't addressed is belief in the community, right? I mean, I started the Denver OS chapter in 2006. Every single meeting, you've got to share belief because there are people in the room that are skeptical. This isn't really what's happening. Okay, you can look here and you can see we're not making it up. There are bad people out there with malicious intent publishing things on massive repos like npm or pypi that are intended, you know, for
Yep.
one thing. And so that's another part of this. And a way to understand this is that put it to work as a developer for sure. If you're in AppSec, put it to work as something that, hey, do 5 minutes of, hey, this is what a bad library looks like. Then unleash your developers, right? And they're curious people, or they tend to be, and they can go look at anything they want to. So if you hit that drop down, we're in PyPy right now. You could drop it down, hit npm. You can hit, some of these other repos that are big. Check it out. Take a look. So,
So
uh,
we did get one question in. We didn't hear anything about sunsetting software. If not done right, it could be taken over. And that is that is a good point because what about what was it? Gorilla Toolkit? That was abandonware.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, it's a perennial problem, isn't it? You've got some software and it's old. Do you update it? If you update it, it takes cost. Somebody's got to test it, all that stuff. So you sunset it. You put it behind a firewall and you leave it. Um, with vulnerabilities, that may be okay. It depends on the vulnerability and it depends on how you got the system set up. What you can't do is just ignore it. You can't say, "Hey, we're putting it behind our firewall. Nothing will hit it." As we saw with Log4j. Log4j, the other reason Log4j was such a wonderful tool was that it was data driven, and I could get data into the system from any endpoint, and it would finally reach some backend system. So if you have a legacy backend system with Log4j the vulnerable version of Log4j in it, the fact that it's not internet facing is irrelevant because if it's connected to a database and that database got the special data in, it would trigger. So when you're talking about legacy systems, it's okay to accept that you're going to sunset them and you're going to stop updating them. You've just got to understand that when vulnerabilities come through, you have got to assess them according to that environment. You can't ignore them just because, hey, we've sunset that. Nobody, we don't care.
Yeah.
Your challenge is to convince your management team that they have to spend money on doing that and not just assuming that sunsetting means that's it, we won't touch it forever.
Couldn't have said that better myself. So any final questions? I'll give it a couple minutes, but just wanted to give you guys some additional resources. So we have had a few other webinars that were on demand. Feel free to check them out. I thought it was super insightful. One is all about AI meets the software supply chain security, or AI is the software supply chain, keeping up with the times, right? So I would check that out. Also, from poison pickles to bad patches. And that's uncovering what we've seen in this first quarter of the year, right? So supply chain threats, how they've been uncovered, and what's been happening with them. So there's security research on there who can explain just that for you. Next thing is next month. So like I said, this is a brand new webinar series here that we're doing through Spectra Collective, which is our community arm. So next month, third Tuesday of the month, May 20th, we'll actually be having VP of Engineering Igor Lasik and associate professor at Harvard Business School, Frank Nagel, to come on and talk about a guide to security acronyms. We'll be covering things from SBOMs to XBOM and more. So join us next time. Check out the resources. We also have the software security supply chain risk report, which I highly recommend looking at, which uncovers in a deep dive from last year what we saw in the industry. So tune in, check out the resources, connect with Steve, Andy, and I on LinkedIn. We're more than happy to answer questions for you, and check out secure.software. So till next time, thanks guys for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. Have to grab a pint next time.
Yes.